I never knew how deep betrayal could cut until it came from my own flesh and blood. My name is Lucas Carter, and I'm 24 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life has been shaped by loss, neglect, and a bitter realization. The man who was supposed to protect me, love me, and stand by me, my father, Mark Carter, cast me aside like an inconvenience. But let's start from the beginning. My mother, Diana, was the kindest, most loving person I ever knew. When she was around, our home felt warm, filled with laughter and the gentle scent of her favorite vanilla-scented candles. I was her shadow, her little helper, her biggest admirer. She had this way of making every moment feel like a precious memory in the making. Even at a young age, I knew she was the glue that held our family together. Then she got sick. I was only 7 when the light in her eyes started to dim. Cancer, a word I barely understood at the time, but I knew it meant something terrible. One day, she was tucking me into bed, reading my favorite bedtime stories, and the next, she was in a hospital bed, frail and exhausted, yet still trying to smile for me. I didn't understand why she couldn't come home. I didn't understand why my dad seemed to be around less and less, leaving me with my grandparents while he handled things. And I certainly didn't understand the moment she took her last breath, how everything I knew, everything that made me feel safe, was suddenly gone. The funeral was a blur. People dressed in black, whispering condolences I didn't want to hear. My father stood there, his expression unreadable. He barely spoke to me that day, barely acknowledged my presence at all. That should have been the first sign. But I was just a kid. I wanted to believe he was grieving in his own way, that he was lost without her, just like I was. That's what I told myself. Until Samantha entered the picture. It didn't take long. Too soon, in fact. My mother's scent still lingered in the house when my father introduced his new friend. Samantha was a beautiful woman, always impeccably dressed, her smile wide and polished. But there was something about her that unsettled me even before I had the words to explain it. She wasn't like my mother. Her presence wasn't warm, it was invasive. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things, that I was just upset and didn't want anyone replacing my mother. But then she moved in, and she didn't come alone. She brought her children, Jordan, who was 9, and Lily, who was 6. Suddenly, my home didn't feel like my own anymore. My room still had my toys, my posters, my mother's touch in every corner, but it was as if I had become an intruder in my own space. Mark? No, my father, was different too. He wasn't the same man who used to lift me onto his shoulders or help me build forts out of blankets in the living room. He was distant, preoccupied. Every time I reached for him, his attention was elsewhere. On Samantha, on Jordan and Lily, on anything but me. Then, at 8 years old, I heard the words that would change my life forever. I think it's best if you stay with your grandparents for a while, he said one night, his tone casual, as if he were suggesting I go visit them for a weekend rather than what it truly was, a permanent exile. I didn't understand. Why? My voice was small, uncertain. He sighed as if I was exhausting him. Lucas, this is for the best. Your grandparents love you, and they have more time to take care of you. Things are different now. Different. That was the word he used to justify pushing me aside, to make room for his new family. He never said it outright, but I could see it. I wasn't part of his vision anymore. I was a leftover piece of a life he wanted to forget. That night, I packed a small bag, still believing it was temporary, that he would come for me, that he would change his mind. But he never did. My grandparents, Harold and Margaret, took me in without hesitation. Their home was different, smaller, quieter, but it was filled with love, the kind of love that didn't feel conditional. They didn't treat me like a burden. They didn't make me feel unwanted. But I couldn't shake the sting of rejection. I waited for my father to call, to visit, to show me that he still cared. And he did, sometimes. But it was always brief. A lunch here, a short phone call there. Enough to keep up appearances, to make it seem like he was still involved. But I knew better. The real confirmation came when I visited one weekend, only to find my old bedroom stripped of everything that made it mine. My posters were gone, my books, my toys. The walls were painted a different color, the furniture rearranged. Jordan and Lily were playing in what was once my sanctuary. I turned to my father, my voice barely above a whisper. Why is Jordan in my room? My father didn't even flinch. He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We needed the space, Lucas. They live here now. That was the moment I realized I had no place in his world anymore. I stopped trying. I stopped reaching out. I stopped caring about a man who had already abandoned me. For years, I told myself I didn't need him, that I had my grandparents, that I had friends, that I would build a future without him. And I did. But deep down, there was always that lingering pain. That question that gnawed at me. Why wasn't I enough? Years passed. I grew up, went to college, and started making plans for my own future. I thought I had moved on. Then, one day, I received a call from my grandparents. "Lucas," my grandfather said gently, "we think it's time you take a look at your mother's will." I frowned, confused. "Her will? You're 24 now? There's something you need to know." I didn't realize that one simple meeting would change everything, that it would give me the key to something I never thought I could reclaim. The house. The house my mother left behind. The house where my father and his new family had been living all these years. The house that legally belonged to me. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the documents in front of me. My mother had left it to me. Not to Mark. Not to his new wife or their children. To me. And my father had known. He had tried to fight it, to overturn it, but he failed. All these years, while I struggled with feeling unwanted, he had been living in what was rightfully mine. A slow, burning anger ignited in my chest. For the first time in my life, I had something over him. For the first time, I had the power. And I wasn't going to waste it. This was my house, and I was going to take it back. Living with my grandparents was the best thing that could have happened to me, even if, at the time, it felt like abandonment. Harold and Margaret Carter weren't just my mother's parents. They were the only real family I had left. Their house was smaller than the one I had lived in with my parents, a modest one-story home with creaky wooden floors and a garden my grandmother adored. It wasn't the grand two-story house I had grown up in, but it was filled with warmth, something my father's home had long since lost. At first, I waited for him. I told myself he'd visit every weekend, that maybe he would even change his mind and take me back home. That's what kids do, they hope, even when it makes no sense. And for a while, he did visit. Once a week, every Sunday afternoon, Mark would show up at my grandparents' house, acting like he still had some claim to me. He would bring a small gift, a toy, a book, something easy, and spend an hour pretending to be interested in my life. I clung to those visits because I thought they meant something. But over time, the visits became less frequent. Once a week became once a month. Once a month became a couple of times a year. Eventually, it became nothing at all. By the time I was 12, my father was just a man I used to know. I didn't stop him. I didn't beg him to come back. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped believing in him. Instead, I focused on my life with Harold and Margaret. My grandfather was a retired mechanic, a man with calloused hands and a heart of gold. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it mattered. He taught me how to change a tire, how to fix things around the house, how to stand on my own 2 feet. He never tried to replace my father, but in a way, he became more of a father than Mark had ever been. Margaret, on the other hand, was the warmth in my world. She taught me how to cook, how to take care of myself, and most importantly, she reminded me every single day that I was loved, that I mattered. I flourished in their care. I did well in school, found hobbies that made me happy, and built friendships that weren't tainted by the betrayal of family. My father's absence no longer felt like an open wound. It was just a fact of life, like the seasons changing or the sun rising in the morning. But even as I moved on, he still loomed in the background. Sometimes, I would overhear my grandparents talking about him when they thought I wasn't listening. I heard the disappointment in their voices, the anger my grandfather tried to keep buried. They never spoke poorly of him in front of me, but I knew how they felt. They had raised his son, done the job he had walked away from, and he barely had the decency to acknowledge it. Then, at 15, I found out the final piece of the puzzle. I had gone to the house, my house, the one my mother left behind. It wasn't the first time I had been back, but it was the first time in years that I had gone inside. My father had invited me over, probably out of some fleeting sense of obligation. I remember standing in the doorway of my old bedroom, feeling like I had stepped into someone else's life. The walls were different. My posters were gone. My bed, my bookshelf, my belongings gone. Jordan's things were everywhere. His toys, his clothes, his presence filled the space that had once been mine. I turned to my father, waiting for an explanation. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even seem to think it was a big deal. Jordan needed a room, he said simply. That was it. No apology. No hesitation. Just a casual, matter-of-fact statement that told me everything I needed to know. I had been replaced. That night, I stopped waiting for my father to love me. I stopped checking my phone, hoping for a text or a call. I stopped wondering if he'd ever regret what he had done. I built my own life. I got my first job at 16, working part-time at a local hardware store. I saved money, studied hard, and planned for a future that didn't include him. I went to college, majoring in business, determined to make something of myself. By the time I was 24, I was ready to start my own company. I had the skills, the determination, and a clear goal in mind. The only problem? I needed capital. I had some savings, but not enough. I considered taking out a loan, but then my grandfather sat me down and reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. The house, he said, placing a thick folder of legal documents in front of me. I frowned. What about it? It's yours, Lucas. Your mother left it to you in her will. I blinked, stunned. I had known, on some level, that my mother had left things for me, but I had never really thought about the details. My grandfather pushed the papers toward me. Your father tried to fight it. He went to court more than once, but the will was ironclad. Your mother made sure of it. I flipped through the documents, my pulse pounding. It was all there, in black and white. The house wasn't my father's. It wasn't Samantha's. It wasn't Jordan's or Lily's. It was mine. My grandfather watched me carefully. Before you make any decisions, you should know. They're struggling. I looked up. What do you mean? Jordan hasn't been able to hold down a job. Lily, well, she's pregnant. The father isn't exactly reliable. I snorted. Not my problem. My grandfather sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I know you're angry. I don't blame you. But if you go after that house, you need to be prepared for the consequences. They won't take it well. I wasn't worried about how they'd take it. For years, I had been pushed aside, treated like an afterthought. But now, the house was my leverage. For the first time in my life, I had the power, and I intended to use it. The moment my grandfather slid the stack of legal documents toward me, everything I thought I knew about my past tilted on its axis. I stared at the papers, my fingers hovering just above them, afraid to touch them as if doing so would somehow make the truth more real. The house, the one I had been cast out of, the one my father had claimed for his new family, was mine. It had always been mine. I looked up at my grandfather, my voice tight. You're telling me this now? Harold sighed, leaning back in his chair. We wanted to tell you when you were older, when you were ready to make your own decisions. I swallowed the lump in my throat, flipping through the documents. The will was clear. My mother had left everything to me. The house, the property, even some financial assets that had been kept in a trust. You said he tried to fight it. I said, my voice quieter now. My grandmother, Margaret, set a cup of tea in front of me, her eyes filled with that soft, motherly concern I had come to know so well. More than once. My grandfather nodded. Your father never accepted that the house wasn't his. The first time he tried to overturn the will, the court denied him outright. Diana had everything sealed so tightly that there was no way to contest it. But that didn't stop him from trying again a few years later. He claimed it would be better if the house were legally in his name, that it was for the family. But the judge shut him down. I exhaled slowly, processing everything. All these years. While I was growing up feeling like I didn't belong, while I watched from the sidelines as my father built a new life without me, he had known. He had known that house wasn't his, that he was living in a place he had no legal right to claim. And still, he had fought to keep it. I set the papers down carefully, my hands steady even as my chest burned with barely contained anger. And now they're struggling. Margaret sighed. Yes, your father and Samantha have been trying to stay afloat, but Jordan hasn't been working, and Lily, well, she's about to have a baby, and the father isn't in the picture. I clenched my jaw. Was I supposed to care? Because I didn't. They had no problem throwing me out, I muttered. Now they're living in my house, acting like it's theirs, like they're entitled to it. You're telling me I should feel sorry for them? Harold didn't say anything for a moment. Then, with the same steady calm he always carried, he said, no one is saying you should feel sorry for them, Lucas. We just want you to be prepared for what comes next. What comes next, I said firmly, is me taking back what's mine. Margaret reached for my hand, her touch gentle. We just don't want you to get hurt. Not physically, but emotionally. This isn't just some strangers you're dealing with. It's your father. No. I corrected her, my voice cold. He stopped being my father a long time ago. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the documents, rereading them over and over again. I had spent years trying to build my own future, telling myself I didn't need my father's approval, his love, or even his acknowledgement. But this house, this was my mother's. Her memory lived in those walls, in the garden she had cared for, in the warmth she had poured into every inch of that place. And he had let someone else claim it. I had always assumed he stayed in that house because it was convenient, because it was the easiest option. But the truth was worse. He had fought to take it from me, even after abandoning me, even after sending me away like I was some burden he didn't want to carry. A fresh wave of anger burned through me. He thought he could take everything from me. He thought I would just let it happen. Not anymore. The next morning, I made my decision. I was going to reclaim the house. Not out of spite. At least, that's what I told myself. But because it was rightfully mine. Because it had been stolen from me in the same way my childhood had been stolen. I picked up my phone and called my father. The line rang, and rang, and rang. Voicemail. I hung up, waited a few seconds, and called again. Voicemail. I gritted my teeth, gripping the phone tightly. He was avoiding me. Fine. If he wouldn't pick up, I would go to him directly. I drove to the house, the place I had been exiled from all those years ago. The driveway was cracked in places, the paint on the shutters peeling. It wasn't in bad condition, but it was clear no one had taken care of it the way my mother had. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I knocked. A moment later, the door swung open, and I found myself face to face with Samantha. She looked surprised to see me, but not in a pleasant way. Her expression quickly shifted from confusion to guarded hostility. "Lucas," she said, crossing her arms. "What are you doing here?" I kept my voice even. "Is my father home?" She hesitated. "He's busy. I'll wait." Samantha's lips thinned, but she stepped aside, letting me in. The house smelled different. Gone was the faint scent of vanilla that my mother used to love. Instead, it smelled like artificial air freshener and something vaguely musty. I walked into the living room, my eyes scanning the space. It wasn't just different, it was unrecognizable. The family photos on the walls. None of them included me. Everything about this place screamed that I didn't belong. A few minutes later, Mark appeared. He looked older, more tired than I remembered, but there was no warmth in his eyes when he saw me. "What do you want, Lucas?" I didn't waste time. "We need to talk about the house." His expression flickered. "What about it?" I met his gaze head on. "It's mine. Legally, it always has been." Silence. Then a scoff. "This again? I thought we were past this." "No," I said firmly. "You were past it. I'm not. You've lived here for years, pretending it was yours, but it's not. My mother left it to me, and I want it back." Samantha bristled. "Lucas, you can't just waltz in here and—" "I can." I interrupted, my voice unwavering. "And I will." Mark exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, son." "Don't," I snapped. "Don't call me that. You lost that right a long time ago." Something flickered in his eyes, but I didn't care. "I could have come in here demanding you leave immediately," I said. "But I didn't. I'm giving you a chance to sort things out before I go the legal route." Samantha's face hardened. "You think you can just kick us out?" "Yes," I said simply. "And I will." Mark exhaled sharply. "Lucas, be reasonable. We have a life here." "So did I," I shot back. "And you threw it away." For the first time in my life, I watched as my father realized something. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't someone he could ignore. And this time, I wasn't backing down. Standing in that house again, I felt a strange mix of emotions. This was the place where I had spent the first years of my life, where my mother's warmth had once filled every room. But now it felt foreign. The home I had been exiled from no longer belonged to me in any way other than on paper. Mark sat across from me, his jaw clenched, his fingers tapping against his knee. Samantha sat beside him, arms crossed, her eyes full of suspicion and hostility. Across the room, Jordan leaned against the wall, silent but clearly fuming. Lily sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around her stomach, staring at me with a glare that was meant to cut. "You can't seriously expect us to just leave," Mark said finally, his voice tight. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I do." Samantha let out a scoff. "You have no idea what you're doing, Lucas. We have nowhere to go." I ignored her. I came here to talk, to give you a chance to figure things out before I take legal action. But if you refuse to cooperate, I won't hesitate to do what I have to." Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're being ridiculous. This house has been our home for years." "It was my home first," I shot back. "And legally, it's mine. You've known that all along." Jordan finally spoke, his voice laced with anger. "You just showed up out of nowhere, trying to ruin our lives." I turned to him. "I didn't just show up. You're living in a house that belongs to me. A house my mother left for me. I didn't throw anyone out. That was your father." Jordan's fists clenched, but he said nothing. Lily let out a bitter laugh. "This is about revenge, isn't it? You're just bitter that Dad didn't want you around. So now you're trying to screw us over." I leveled my gaze at her. "This isn't about revenge. It's about what's fair. This house was stolen from me, and I have every right to take it back." Samantha shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. "You act like you're some kind of victim, but look at us. We've built a life here. We've taken care of this place. And now you just want to take it away?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "You took care of it? You mean you lived here rent-free for years while my father ignored the fact that he was trespassing on my property?" Mark's eyes darkened. "You have no idea what it took to keep this family together." I let out a dry chuckle. "No, I don't. Because I wasn't part of it." The room fell silent. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to push down the bitterness that threatened to rise. "Look, I understand that this is hard for you. I'm not heartless. That's why I'm giving you time to figure things out. I'm not asking you to leave tomorrow. I'll give you 3 months. That's plenty of time to find somewhere else." Samantha shook her head. "That's not enough. We have nowhere to go." "Not my problem," I said, my voice firm. "I didn't put you in this situation. Mark did, when he decided to steal this house from me." Mark stood abruptly, his face twisted in frustration. "I did what I had to for my family." I stood too, staring him down. And what was I? Silence. My chest tightened, but I pushed the emotions away. 3 months. That's my offer. Mark's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "And if we don't leave?" I met his gaze. "Then I'll take legal action. And trust me, you don't want to go down that road." Lily scoffed. "You're unbelievable." I turned to her, my voice cold. "So are you. You're the one living in a stolen house and acting like I'm the villain." She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't in the mood to listen. I turned to my father. 3 months. That's generous. Take it or leave it." Mark clenched his jaw, but said nothing. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out the door, slamming it shut behind me. I sat in my car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. That hadn't gone as well as I had hoped, but at least the message was clear. They had 3 months. That was more than fair. Would they leave willingly? I doubted it. But at least I had tried to do this the peaceful way. Now it was up to them. The next few weeks were filled with silence. I heard nothing from Mark, Samantha, or their children. No calls, no messages. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe they were actually considering leaving. Maybe they realized they had no choice. But then, one evening, I got a call from my grandfather. "You need to be careful," Harold said, his voice serious. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I heard from an old friend that your father's been talking. He's not planning to leave." My stomach tightened. "What?" Harold sighed. "He's acting like you're the bad guy. Like you're some heartless kid trying to ruin his life. He's telling everyone that you're trying to steal the house." I clenched my jaw. "That house was never his." "I know," Harold said. "But he's not seeing it that way. Just be careful. If he won't leave willingly, you might have to force him." I swallowed hard. I was afraid of that. My grandfather hesitated. "I know you wanted to handle this peacefully. But Lucas, some people don't respond to kindness. Sometimes, you have to fight for what's yours." I exhaled, rubbing my temple. "Yeah, I know. I had given them a chance. I had tried to be fair. But if they weren't going to leave peacefully, then I had no choice. It was time to take legal action." The next morning, I made a call. "I need to speak to a lawyer," I said firmly. The woman on the other end of the line responded with professionalism. "What kind of case are you dealing with?" "Property dispute," I said. "I need to reclaim a house that legally belongs to me." She paused. "Do you have the necessary documents to prove ownership?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Then you have a case." I exhaled slowly. "Good. Because I'm done waiting." 15 years. 15 years since my mother had taken her last breath, since the warmth in my childhood home had been replaced by coldness. since my father had chosen to erase everything she stood for. And yet, here I was, standing alone at her gravesite, the autumn wind biting against my skin, the leaves rustling softly around me. I knelt down, brushing away a few stray leaves from the marble headstone that bore her name. Diana Carter, beloved mother and wife, forever in our hearts. A lump formed in my throat. I traced the letters with my fingers, my chest tightening. "Hey, Mom," I murmured. "I know it's been a while." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "I should have come sooner. I should have done more to honor you." 15 years. And what had my father done in that time? He had remarried in less than a year. He had pushed me out of his life. He had raised a new family in the house my mother had loved, pretending she had never existed. But I remembered. I had never stopped remembering. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small bouquet of white lilies I had brought for her. They had been her favorite. Carefully, I placed them at the base of the headstone. "I know you'd be disappointed in him," I whispered, "but I hope you'd be proud of me." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to crash over me. "I'm taking the house back, Mom. The house you left for me. He stole it, but I won't let him keep it. I won't let him erase you." The words felt heavier than I expected. I straightened up, taking one last look at her name, then turned to leave. Today, of all days, I had given my father one last chance. I had sent him an invitation to a memorial service in honor of my mother's passing. I had kept it small, just me, my grandparents, and a few close family friends who still remembered her. And I had sent an invitation to Mark. Deep down, I had known he wouldn't come. But some foolish, childlike part of me had still held on to the tiniest sliver of hope. Hope that he would finally acknowledge her. Hope that he would at least pretend to care. But he hadn't even bothered to respond. After the memorial, I drove straight to the house. I didn't knock. I walked right up to the door and rang the bell, my hands in my pockets, my jaw tight. A few seconds later, the door swung open. It was Lily. She took one look at me and rolled her eyes. "Oh, great. What do you want now?" I ignored her and stepped forward. "Where's Mark?" she huffed, crossing her arms. "Busy." I stepped inside, forcing her to move. "I'll find him myself." She scoffed. Unbelievable. I walked through the house, my fists clenched. The sound of a football game blared from the living room. And there he was, lounging on the couch, a beer in hand, looking completely unbothered. The sight of him, relaxed and unconcerned on today of all days, made something snap inside me. "You didn't come," I said, my voice sharper than I had intended. He barely glanced at me. "What are you talking about?" I clenched my jaw. "The memorial. For Mom." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, that." I stared at him. "You didn't even have the decency to acknowledge it." He sighed heavily, setting his beer down. "Lucas, you need to move on. It's been 15 years. There's no point in dwelling on the past." Something cold settled in my stomach. "You think honoring my mother is dwelling on the past?" He rubbed his temple, clearly annoyed. "I mean, what's the point? She's gone. She's been gone for a long time. There's no need to keep acting like it still matters." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. "It matters to me." Lily scoffed from behind me. "Of course it does. You always act like she was some saint. Newsflash, she's dead. Get over it." I turned on her so fast she actually flinched. "You don't get to talk about her." She rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. "So dramatic." I turned back to my father, my hands shaking with rage. "You never cared, did you?" Mark exhaled, looking exhausted. "I loved your mother, but life moves on, Lucas. I had to move forward. I had a new family to take care of. And I wasn't part of that family," I said bitterly. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. I laughed, the sound hollow. "You know what? I finally get it now. You didn't just replace her. You erased her." His gaze hardened. "That's not fair." I gestured around the room. "Where are the pictures of her? Where is anything that belonged to her? You made sure there was no trace of her left in this house. You tried to fight her will, tried to take the house away from me. You did everything you could to pretend she never existed." His jaw clenched. "Don't start, Lucas." "No," I snapped. "You don't get to tell me what to do anymore." Samantha appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "What's going on?" I ignored her. My entire focus was on Mark. "You don't deserve this house. You don't deserve to live here, pretending like none of this ever happened." Mark let out a bitter chuckle. "And what you do? What do you even want with this place?" I took a deep breath. "I want you out." His eyes widened slightly, But then he smirked. You're serious. Dead serious. He scoffed. You're just doing this to punish me. No, I said coldly. I'm doing this because it's mine. And because you don't deserve to live here while you spit on my mother's memory. Silence stretched between us. Then Mark stood up, his face hard. You think you can just walk in here and take everything away from us? I met his gaze. You took everything from me first. For the first time, something flashed in his eyes, something almost like regret. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Samantha sighed dramatically. This is ridiculous. No, I said. What's ridiculous is that I even gave you a chance to do this peacefully. Mark shook his head. We're not leaving. I nodded slowly. Then you leave me no choice. His expression darkened. You wouldn't. I held his gaze. Watch me. Without another word, I turned and walked out. I had given him every opportunity to do this the easy way. Now, it was time to do it the hard way. I pulled out my phone and made the call. Start the eviction process, I said. I want them out. The moment I hung up the phone with my lawyer, I felt an unsettling mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. I had tried to handle this peacefully. I had given my father every chance to do the right thing, to leave on his own terms. But he had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. I didn't sleep well that night. Even though I had spent years convincing myself that I didn't need him, that his rejection no longer hurt, the truth was that this wasn't just about a house. This was about everything. Every moment of neglect, every betrayal, every year of being cast aside in favor of a new family. But this time, I was in control. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Claire Marshall. She had handled complex property disputes before, and after reviewing the case, she assured me that I had every legal right to reclaim my house. The will is airtight, she said, flipping through the documents. Your mother made sure of that. Your father may have lived there for years, but he has no legal claim to the property. We'll start by sending an official eviction notice. I nodded. How long does he have? She adjusted her glasses. Legally, tenants. Though he's not a legal tenant since he's never paid rent, have 30 days to vacate. Since you've already given him an informal warning, this notice makes it official. If he refuses to leave after 30 days, we escalate to court, and the judge will issue an order for him to be removed. I exhaled. And if he still refuses? Claire's gaze was steady. Then we get the authorities involved. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or exhausted. I want this handled as quickly as possible. She nodded. Then let's begin. 2 days later, my father received the eviction notice. The call came shortly after. I had been expecting it, but when my phone rang and I saw his name flashing on the screen, I hesitated before answering. The moment I picked up, his voice was filled with barely restrained fury. What the hell is this, Lucas? I remained calm. It's exactly what it looks like. You have 30 days to vacate the house. You can't be serious, he snapped. You're really going through with this? I clenched my jaw. I warned you. His voice grew desperate. We have nowhere else to go. I closed my eyes. That's not my problem. Lucas, you don't understand what this will do to us, he said, his voice taking on a pleading edge. Lily is pregnant. Jordan doesn't have a job. Samantha. I cut him off. You should have thought about that before you stole from me. You had years to prepare for this. Instead, you acted like you'd never have to face the consequences. Silence. Then his tone changed, turning sharp. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I let out a humorless laugh. No, but I'm not going to let you manipulate me. His voice turned cold. You always were selfish. My grip tightened on the phone. You abandoned me when I was 8 years old. You let another boy take my room. You erased my mother from that house. And now, when you finally have to deal with the fallout, I'm the selfish one. More silence. Then he let out a frustrated sigh. You're making a mistake. No, Dad, I said evenly. I'm fixing one. And then I hung up. I knew he wouldn't leave without a fight. 3 days later, I received an email from Claire. Subject, urgent, harassment claim filed against you. I stared at the subject line, my stomach sinking. Opening the email, I skimmed through the legal jargon until I reached the heart of it. Lily Carter has filed a complaint, claiming that you have been harassing her and causing her emotional distress during her pregnancy. I exhaled sharply. Are you kidding me? I immediately called Claire. I just saw the email, I said as soon as she answered. What is this nonsense? She sounded unimpressed. It's a weak attempt to stall the eviction process. She's claiming that your presence and actions have been causing her severe stress, which is endangering her pregnancy. I rubbed a hand over my face. I haven't even spoken to her outside of that one conversation. And that was weeks ago. I know, Claire said. This is common in cases like this. They're trying to buy time. I shook my head. What do? We fight it, she said. I'll respond with evidence that contradicts her claims. If it escalates, we'll demand proof of harassment. I took a deep breath. All right, but it didn't stop there. A few days later, I received a voicemail. It was from Jordan. I pressed play. His voice was low and full of barely concealed rage. You think you're so powerful, don't you? Just walking in and ruining everything. You think you can take away our home, and we'll just let you? I frowned. Jordan's voice grew darker. You'd better watch yourself, Lucas. You have no idea what you're messing with. I immediately saved the voicemail and sent it to Claire. Her response was immediate. Take this to the police. Now, an hour later, I sat across from a police officer, playing the voicemail for him. This is a direct threat, the officer said, writing notes. You're filing for eviction, correct? I nodded. Yes. He let out a sigh. Situations like these can get ugly. Do you want to file a restraining order? I hesitated. Then I remembered the way Jordan had looked at me that day, the barely concealed hostility in his eyes. Yes, I said finally. I do. The legal battle continued. Lily's harassment claim was dismissed due to lack of evidence. My restraining order against Jordan was approved. And my father? He called one last time. This is your final chance, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Drop this, and we'll find a way to work something out. I laughed bitterly. You still think you're in control? This isn't over, he said, his voice low. For you? No, I said. For me? It's almost done. Then I hung up. The countdown had begun, and soon, they would be out of my house. The day had finally come. For weeks, I had been preparing for this moment, gathering legal documents, filing restraining orders, and ensuring every step of the eviction process was airtight. My lawyer, Claire, had assured me that we were completely in the right, but I knew that wouldn't make today any easier. I arrived at the house early in the morning. My stomach was tense, my jaw clenched so tightly that my head ached. The police were already there, along with my lawyer. 2 officers stood near their patrol car, their presence necessary to ensure things didn't escalate beyond control. I took a deep breath and stepped out of my car. This was it. I walked up the driveway, my eyes scanning the house. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn. It was as if they were trying to shut out the reality of what was about to happen. One of the officers nodded at me. Mr. Carter? I nodded back. Yeah. He glanced at his watch. They have exactly 3 hours to vacate the premises. If they refuse, we'll have to escalate. I exhaled sharply. Understood. Claire stepped beside me, adjusting the strap of her bag. Are you ready for this? I gave her a tight smile. I don't think I have a choice. She nodded, then motioned for the officers to proceed. One of them walked up to the front door and knocked. A long, tense silence followed. Then, the door swung open. Mark stood there, his face twisted in a deep scowl. Behind him, Samantha hovered near the staircase, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jordan and Lily stood farther back, their eyes burning with resentment. Time's up, the officer said flatly. You need to vacate the premises. Mark's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. You can't just throw us out like this. Claire stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Legally, we can. You were given 30 days. You chose to ignore it. Samantha scoffed. Where are we supposed to go? I shrugged. Not my problem. Lily, standing by the couch, let out a bitter laugh. You're a real piece of work, Lucas. I turned my gaze on her. You had plenty of time to figure something out. You wasted it trying to fight me. Jordan, standing beside her, clenched his fists. You think this makes you powerful? You think this makes you better than us? I sighed, already exhausted. I think this makes me someone who's reclaiming what's rightfully his. The officer checked his watch. You have 3 hours. I suggest you start packing. Mark's shoulders tensed. We need more time. I shook my head. No. Samantha's eyes flashed with anger. You're heartless. I stared at her, unflinching. You stole my home. I'm just taking it back. She opened her mouth to argue, but the officer cut in. Enough. You have 3 hours. If you're still here after that, we'll remove you ourselves. With that, the conversation was over. The next 3 hours were a chaotic mess. Samantha and Lily scrambled to pack what they could, throwing things into bags and boxes with frantic desperation. Jordan stormed in and out of rooms, cursing under his breath, slamming doors, making as much noise as possible. Mark, on the other hand, just sat on the couch, staring at the floor. He barely moved. He barely spoke. It was as if reality had finally crashed down on him, and he didn't know how to handle it. At one point, Claire leaned in toward me and murmured, "He's taking this harder than I expected." I crossed my arms. He never thought I'd actually go through with it. She studied him for a moment. "And how do you feel?" I hesitated, looking at him, at the man who had thrown me away so easily all those years ago. Once, I had wanted nothing more than his approval. Now, I felt nothing but cold detachment. "I feel like this is justice," I said finally. She nodded. "Then don't let guilt get in the way." I exhaled sharply, pushing away whatever lingering doubts were trying to creep in. This was the right thing to do. This was necessary. The 3-hour deadline arrived. The officers stepped forward. "Time's up." Samantha let out a bitter laugh, throwing one last bag into the trunk of their car. "You really did it." I didn't respond. Jordan shot me a venomous glare. "You better hope we never see you again." I met his gaze, unfazed. "That's the plan." Lily climbed into the car, slamming the door behind her. Samantha followed. Mark was the last to move. Slowly, he rose from the couch, his movements sluggish. Then he turned to me. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, finally, he spoke. "I never wanted things to end up like this." I tilted my head. "You made your choices." His jaw tightened. "So did you." I nodded. "And I'd make them again." For a second, I thought he might say something else. But then he just shook his head and walked past me, stepping outside. The car doors slammed shut, and then they were gone. Just like that. I stood there for a long time, staring at the now empty house. My house. It didn't feel real. Claire rested a hand on my shoulder. "It's done." I nodded slowly. "Yeah." The officers left soon after, their job completed. Claire gave me a small smile. "Take some time to process this. If you need anything, call me." "Thanks, Claire." And then, I was alone. For the first time in 15 years, I stood inside my childhood home, completely alone. The silence was deafening. I walked through the house slowly, my fingers brushing against the walls, the furniture, the places where my mother's touch had once been. It felt empty. It felt foreign. But it was mine again. And that was all that mattered. The house was mine again. But as I stood in the middle of the empty living room, I didn't feel the overwhelming satisfaction I had expected. I had spent so many years thinking about this moment, imagining what it would be like to finally take back what was rightfully mine, to walk through these halls without feeling like an outsider, to reclaim the home my mother had left for me. But instead of triumph, there was only silence. A hollow, eerie kind of silence that reminded me that this place had once been filled with life, warmth, and love, and that now, it was just a shell of what it used to be. I ran a hand through my hair and let out a slow breath. There was work to be done. The first thing I did was call a locksmith. I didn't trust that my father and his family wouldn't try something reckless. They had fought tooth and nail to keep a house that wasn't theirs, and I wouldn't put it past Jordan or even Lily to try and get back inside. Within an hour, a locksmith arrived, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a quiet efficiency. "Changing all the locks?" he asked as he examined the front door. "Yeah," I said. "Every single one." He nodded and got to work. As he worked, I walked through the house, checking every room. It was strange seeing it this empty. The furniture was still here, things my father and Samantha had bought over the years, but the house itself felt abandoned, stripped of the artificial life they had forced into it. I stopped in what used to be my mother's bedroom, or rather, what had once been my parents' bedroom. I clenched my jaw, disgust curling in my stomach as I realized this was the room my father had shared with Samantha for years, erasing every trace of my mother's presence. I didn't know what I had expected. Of course, he hadn't kept any of my mother's things. Of course, he had let another woman replace her, let another family claim this space as their own. I stepped out of the room, inhaling sharply. This house needed to be purified. It needed to be cleansed of everything they had tainted. By the time the locksmith finished, I had already made my decision. This house wasn't meant to be my home anymore. The memories that remained were too painful, the presence of my father's betrayal too deeply embedded into the walls. But that didn't mean I was going to let it go to waste. The next morning, I called a real estate agent. "I want to lease the house," I told her. But I want full control over the tenants. She was a sharp, well-dressed woman named Evelyn, and she immediately understood my concerns. You want to make sure you're renting to the right people, she said with a nod. I can arrange that. Good, I said. I want someone who will take care of it. Someone who will respect it. Evelyn smiled. I'll find you the perfect tenants. Securing the house was only the first step. The second step was making sure I was protected. I called Claire again. I want a restraining order, I told her. She sighed, but there was no surprise in her voice. Against who? All of them. A pause. Then, good call. Filing for a restraining order was simpler than I had expected. With the evidence I had, the threats from Jordan, the false harassment claim from Lily, my father's history of ignoring legal warnings, it didn't take long for the judge to approve it. Now, if they tried to contact me, to show up unannounced, or to retaliate in any way, there would be legal consequences. I wouldn't allow them to drag me back into their toxicity. Not again. Never again. A week passed. Then two. The house remained empty, but I was finally beginning to breathe again. I poured my energy into my business, into securing my future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. One afternoon, I visited my grandparents. Harold greeted me at the door, his sharp eyes scanning my face as if trying to gauge how I was holding up. Margaret pulled me into a warm hug, her soft hands pressing against my back. You look better, she said. I smiled. I feel better. We sat in the living room, the scent of fresh tea filling the air. Is it done? Harold asked. I nodded. The house is mine. The locks have been changed. I filed for a restraining order. He exhaled, nodding approvingly. Good. Margaret patted my hand. And what about you? How do you feel? I hesitated. Then I said, lighter. They both smiled. I realized then that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not manipulation. Not betrayal. Just love. A month later, Evelyn called. I found the perfect tenants, she said excitedly. A young couple, newlyweds. They're looking for a long-term rental, and they love the house. They seem responsible, financially stable, and they're thrilled about the place. I considered it. It wasn't the future I had once imagined for the house. But maybe that was okay. Let's move forward, I said. I visited the house one last time before handing over the keys. I walked through each room, taking in the silence, the emptiness. This place had been the source of so much pain. But now it was a fresh start. Not for me, but for someone else. And that was enough. As I stepped out of the house for the last time, I didn't look back. I had spent years chasing after something that would never be mine again. But now, I was finally ready to let go. The house had been a prison. Now it was just a house. And I was finally free.